for tuning in to the Wing Space podcast. This podcast is not a replacement for mental health treatment or professional health care. In case of crisis or emergency, please contact your local healthcare provider or dial 911.
Welcome to the Wing Space podcast, episode number 8. Here at the Wing Space podcast, we want to talk about health and wellness and faith and fitness and family and all things about this crazy life. And today we're going to dive into this idea of faith and of wellness and how we can mesh those things together. Today we welcome our very first guest on the podcast, Linda Shaffer from Align Christ-Centered Yoga, and our conversation today is going to be centered around yoga and Christianity and how Christians can engage in the practice of yoga for health and wellness. So feel free to grab a mat, take a listen as we engage in this conversation. All right, so welcome to the podcast. Today I have special guest, our very first guest, Linda Shaffer. So welcome, Linda. Glad
Thanks.
to have you here. Do you want to tell our audience a little bit about who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah. So about 30 years ago, I started teaching group exercise. I was also an assistant gym manager. I was a personal trainer. So I lived in the fitness world. And then simultaneously with that, I started youth ministry. And so God brought these two worlds together, both of which are healing and both of which are ministry to me. But it's connecting the body and the soul, and ultimately the mind in the middle of both of those. So he wove those two together into Christ-Centered Yoga about 15 years ago. So I've been teaching it ever since.
Awesome. Now, I know that oftentimes because yoga is rooted in Hindu tradition, there are many Christians who struggle and wrestle with this idea of practicing yoga. So can you just share a little bit about how or really can Christians practice yoga?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of different ways to practice yoga. Yoga can be a purely physical practice, something you do on a mat in a gym with a trainer, and you're stretching this muscle and you're strengthening that muscle, and it's 100% physical. I think at its best, yoga is a spiritual practice. But it is rooted in Hindu tradition. So how do we do that? So many of the poses are named after Hindu gods. And that brings to mind, if you're a Hindu, the stories of those gods and the stories of that faith. I don't use those names, I use English names, right? And so when I teach, I point to Christ instead. And I use the poses and I use the practice to point us to the story of our God.
Awesome. Can you talk a little bit more about how a Christian can engage in yoga as part of their spiritual practice while also getting the physical benefits of that practice?
So the Psalms talk about the physical practice of worship. So throughout Scripture, we see people raising their hands in praise. And we see people bowing down before their God. Yoga incorporates all of these poses, and so it becomes a physical worship. And it depends on which Christian denomination you're a part of. A Pentecostal Christian is used to using their body in praise. Mm-hmm. Maybe a mainline Protestant Christian is really uncomfortable with that. But yoga is a way to incorporate that physical movement so that we're not just praying with our words, but we're praying and we're worshiping with our bodies as well.
It's really, really exciting to be able to weave our faith into the physical wellness space of our bodies. You talked about when you engage in your classes that you bring Christ into the poses. So can you share with us a little bit about what it might sound like for a person who's in your classes, the things that they might hear, how you invite Christ into the practice of your class?
Sure. So just recently I have a YouTube channel. So just recently I did a practice on YouTube that was all about practicing the transitions from one pose into the next. And I just talked about throughout the practice how uncomfortable we often are with transitioning from one place to another, and how I think our human tendency is to want to get there very quickly, but how often God stretched that out for us. The Israelites had 40 years in the wilderness, and the reason that they had that was because God didn't think that they were ready. He could have taken them the quick way into Philistine, but if he had done that, he was afraid that they would encounter war and turn back. So instead, he took them to the Red Sea, where he could show them his power, and he could show them that they would be protected and that they would be safe under his wing. And then he took them into the desert so that they could get strong and they could see him over and over again. So I just wove that through the practice as we just practiced transitions.
Right.
And started to get comfortable with them.
It's interesting, as you're talking, I'm thinking about some of my own yoga practice and times that I've maybe moved too quickly into a pose and I've stumbled or I haven't been quite balanced. And sometimes that happens in our daily life outside of yoga practice, that we move on our time rather than waiting for God's time, and we stumble, and sometimes we have to wait until he says it's time. So weaving that into the physical practice of yoga is, it's really cool when you can take things from one place to another and kind of weave it into your day and into your wellness. That's really great. Is there anything in terms of key differences between yoga philosophy and Christian theology?
Yeah, there's a lot. So yoga philosophy is about working your way into a state of bliss or samadhi. But the goal itself is different. So samadhi is this sense of oneness with the universe, kind of like a drop of water in the ocean. So you've become part of the ocean and you're just moving as the ocean moves. As Christians, we understand that we're never God. The Bible calls us for us to be united with God and to have the heart and the mind of God and to fix our eyes on God. But ultimately, we're always his children. And he is God and we are not. So from a Christian theology standpoint, our goal in yoga is to get us to that point where we are surrendered and open to the work of God in our lives so that he can transform us and bring us into where he wants us to be. The other fundamental difference is that yoga philosophy says that there's these 8 limbs of yoga, the 8th of which is samadhi and bliss, and that if you do all of these other things, you will achieve this bliss.
Okay.
But as Christians, we understand and worship a God who came down to us. And so that first step is just to know that we are loved by him. Mm. And then all of these other things that we do, which are not dissimilar to those 8 limbs of yoga, but all of those other things we do flow out of that. So it's upside down. So we start with understanding that we are loved and that we are precious and that we have purpose. Mm-hmm. And then out of that flows our desire for purity, or our desire to serve others, or our desire to comfort, right? And that's very different than yoga, which says if we do these things, then maybe we will reach this sense of enlightenment.
I was doing my meditation or my devotion this morning, and it was just kind of reminding us that God is first, and we love God, and then we love others, and through that connection of loving God and then loving your neighbor, the commandments as we heard Jesus talk about them, and I feel like sometimes we have our priorities a little mixed, but it sounds like with engaging in a faith-based, Christian-centered yoga, you are worshiping God with your body, but also being able to take care of yourself So loving yourself, loving your body, and then also that community that you might find within the class.
Yes.
Okay. What else do you think that our folks that are listening or watching might want or need to know as a Christian to be able to feel as though they're able to engage in this practice that you offer?
I think as a yoga practitioner, you need to be intentional about the way that you practice yoga. I believe that you can walk into any yoga class as a Christian and you can practice it and you can gain something from it. But if I'm taking a class that's very steeped in Hindu philosophy, maybe there's music going on in the background that is literally calling on other gods, then for me that practice becomes a practice of praying for the people around me who don't know Jesus yet, and for praying that Jesus can show them how loved that they are and how close he can draw near to them. If I'm taking just a secular class that has nothing but the physical piece of it, then I set my own intention, and maybe I pray for somebody specifically, or maybe that's a day where I'm just praising God for the things that he's done, or just for who he is.
Yeah.
And if I'm in a Christ-centered class, and that's my sweet spot, then I'm listening to worship music in the background, and I'm praying the scriptures, and I'm beginning to connect scripture with my yoga practice with my life, so that I can take it off the mat and become that, this Christian who's not compartmentalized anymore.
Yeah, that's
With
good.
faith over here and fitness over here and life over here, but it's all together.
All together. Yeah, that's great. That's great. So I know we're going to in the future have another conversation about the mind and body connection that allows us to begin to heal from traumas in our physical body through some body work. But for today, can you tell the folks that are listening where they might be able to find you? And I'm curious, is there kind of an easy way that they can start to engage with you in the event that maybe they're not ready to come into a class here in our studio or in one of the other places that you teach? But maybe just share with our listeners where they can find you and where they can begin to learn this physical practice, these classes you're doing.
So we've got lots of options, and I have a website, alignccY.com, and it's all laid out for you there, so you don't need to remember any of this. But I have a YouTube channel, and on that YouTube channel I have hundreds of classes and dozens of playlists. So maybe you just go, if you're a beginner, there's a Back to the Basics playlist, or there's also a deep stretch playlist if you just want to kind of hold those poses the way you would in a yin class or a restorative class. I teach a Zoom class, and you can always turn your camera off and join us there. Both of those are completely free, and just open to anybody and everybody. I teach a class here on Tuesday nights for addiction recovery. So that's an interesting class. It actually incorporates a meeting as well as a practice. And the reason that we do that is because we know that we need to process things with the thinking part of our brain, but it's also important once we've done that to physically let that go. And so after we have the meeting, whatever has sort of bubbled up, we can begin to soften the body and to just release all of that. That class is, I have a suggested $10 donation for that. But it's open to absolutely anybody. If you don't have the financial resources, you're welcome to come. It's also a class that's open not only to somebody who's in active recovery, but maybe somebody who's been in recovery for 10 years. It's for all the A's, so that's Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, all of those. It's also for Al-Anon. So maybe you're the parent or the best friend of somebody who's in the throes of addiction, or maybe it happened years ago, but your life is still off center because you were walking on eggshells for so long, caring for that person. So this class is open to you too. So that's my Yoga for 12-Step Recovery class. And then I teach a straight up in-person Christ-centered class on Thursday mornings at First Saints Community Church here in Leonardtown. And then I don't think I mentioned it, but I also, I did mention the Zoom class. Did I mention the Zoom?
You did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So YouTube, Zoom, and Y12S are here. And yeah, straight up Christ-centered yoga at First Saints.
Yeah. What is your YouTube channel?
It is Aligned Christ-centered yoga.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keeping it simple. So if you're watching us on YouTube, while you're still on that site, you can search for Align Christ-centered yoga. And if you're listening to us through one of the streaming apps, then be sure to check out Linda's website, and we'll make sure that all that information is available to you through our show notes and things like that. Anything else you want to leave our listeners with today?
Don't be afraid of yoga. Even if you've never been on a mat before, you know how good it feels to stretch. And yoga is a practice that is a very individualized practice. So in a room of a dozen people, everybody's pose is going to look different. Everybody's pose is going to feel different. Yoga is all about learning how to get comfortable in your own body and listening and trusting what your body is telling you. So whether you are brand new to the mat or whether you've been practicing yoga for decades, there's a place for you in almost any class. Even if you accidentally end up in the wrong class, most instructors are going to be really open to you modifying that practice and just doing what you need to do in that day. So don't be afraid of yoga, and come on out and check it out.
Awesome. Well, it was great to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation as we dig a little bit deeper into trauma and how we can heal from trauma through the use of some physical practices, including Christ-centered yoga. And we're really glad that you joined us today, and I hope you have a great day.